Hi, everybody, and welcome to Cults and the Culting of America. This is a special episode, which means you just got me and not Scott. So that's why you are missing his lovely radio voice. Today, our guest is Jamal Bruce, who is a very, very interesting human that I have connected with through social media, who has read my book or is reading Uncultured. And we're going to have a conversation about that. And, just to start off with the hottest topic first. You are a Black man. I am a white woman. Nobody predicted. There was no predicted model that showed that Jamal Bruce was going to read Uncultured.
And here I am.
I'm just going to open with that.
Yeah, and I mean, what an incredible story, right? I think that the notion that, a Black man or any man, while we know why people will say that, right? But I think that there's so much within your story that I think can, one, show us so much about, our world and the society that we live in. But there's so much that I related to, in my life growing up in the suburbs of Chicago and in the city of Chicago. So, I mean, it has really been one of the most eye-opening reads that I think I've read in the last 5 years, at least. So I'm happy to be here talking about it with you.
You, yeah. And you are a teacher, right? What do you teach?
Yes. So I have taught across the gamut. So I've taught as young as kindergarten, and right now I teach high school English. So English, and I also teach some special education as well embedded in that. And I've actually brought it into my class. A lot of my students recognize Captain Mestyanek from social media. They know who Knitting Cult Lady is. And so when I brought the book into my classroom, I mean, they were just over the moon that I even had it, let alone a signed copy. I mean, they were ecstatic and they couldn't wait to read it. And I told them that, we would get to that as soon as I would start reading it. But yeah, I'm a teacher here in Chicago. I've been a teacher for this will be my 8th year teaching, and I'm actually also in my master's program for social work. So, staying kind of in the realm of education and social change and reform.
Yeah, and this was a decision you made pretty recently, right? To switch tracks?
Yes, very recently. One of the things actually that kind of pivoted me was reading your story and connecting it to my own. And then what I'll say is, as a teacher, especially as a Black educator, I think that there's so much red tape around what we can do, what we can say, how we can act, and how we can advocate for our communities, especially when children are involved. And I'm kind of I don't like the red tape. I don't like the red tape, and I think going into social work allows me to kind of maneuver in that red around that red tape in a way that being an educator cannot. And so that is kind of what's made me pivot. And I think it can allow me to still work with kids and work with youth in our communities, but I can like push the boundary a lot more without so much pushback from others.
I know in Uncultured, there's a scene that was super pivotal in my life, which is when a high school counselor who was Black uh,
Mhm.
sees me, sees that I need help, which I don't think, barely ever anyone did. One of the interesting thing is there's been 4 times in my life that somebody has seen me and seen that I needed help. Every single time it was a woman of color.
Mhm.
And I think about that a lot.
Mhm.
As you said, like I think there's this element of advocating for the community and for the kids that is just so genuinely there in communities of color that I tend to find missing in white America, where you just get lost. I mean, I have so much love and so much respect for people who work in, both education and social work, but like work with children, because the amount of pain and heartbreak that you put up with in addition to everything else must be a lot. But, the lives that you touch is really incredible. And, by the way, I have been back in touch with Ms. Raybon, who's the high school counselor. She got to read it. Everyone in her family, I think, has a signed copy.
Awesome.
And it's nice to get to see that, I mean, she literally changed my whole life just by setting me on a track to consider college, which was not something I thought I could do right away. Like, I literally was going to graduate high school and go straight into the Marines.
Mhm.
Ironically, I ended up in the military anyway. Still, and as challenging as my experience goes on to be, it was still
Mhm,
better. I appreciated the way that I did it. And
mhm.
I think it's so, I mean, it's not really a question here. I'm sorry. I just want to say to
No, no.
you, as someone who is like in the fight right now with educating kids in a country that is leaving all the children behind and
Oh, yeah.
and not supporting people, that people like you change lives every day, all the time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I think, to kind of jump in on that, I think, as a Black educator, oftentimes we, having gone through the educational experience, oftentimes in a very white dominant space, and if it's not dominated by white teachers or kids, administrators, it's usually, the larger entity of the district or the organization is, led by white folks. And so I think oftentimes we know what that experience is like to go through and really not have anyone on your side unless it's your friends or something, right? So we, I think, are twice as vigilant, I should say, when we are looking for certain things and looking at behaviors and wondering, why does this child act like this? Or what's that about? Or I noticed they're in the back there and they haven't really said anything. Or I noticed that, like, every time these particular kids come in the room, I notice the body language change, right? And I think we're more careful about those things because we know that that's the experience. And to be honest, I don't think a lot of white educators or just people outside of education, I don't think they know to even look for those things because
Yeah.
it's being comfortable in the situation. And so they assume
Like,
everybody is.
yeah, like the way my teachers of color, especially in high school, like they all knew that I came to school in business clothes because I worked at a law firm right after school, right? Whereas to
Hmm.
my white teachers, I wasn't 16-year-old girl living by myself, putting myself through high school. Like, I don't even feel like that was an option in their
Hmm.
minds.
Hmm. And what I've noticed is that they don't seek to understand that, right? There's just this blanketed notion that they have for everyone. And what becomes problematic is that you strip away somebody's humanity and you also strip away your own humanity, right? When you don't engage them with the time and the energy and the patience, to get to know them beyond just the books, right? Because we're all human. And so we deserve to be seen as human beings and not just as like some robot sitting in a seat getting an assignment done for the sake of the larger, you know, district entity, whatever it is.
And that's where I think we come back to the educational experience being kind of like a cult
Mm-hmm.
in America, and I've actually been writing a bit about the Puritans and how, like,
Hmm.
the Puritans, if we look at the Puritans through today's eyes, that was a cult. That was not very different from Jim Jones going
Hmm.
to Guyana. And I'm trying to kind of like figure out how to tell that story in a way that white America can start to see, like, it wasn't religious freedom. It was freedom to practice our religion, and our religion says you're not free.
Correct.
And and the Puritans actually are the ones that invented universal education.
Hmm.
They were the first ones really to implement, whether other people had the concept, but to implement all kids go to school, not
Hmm.
just only the privileged ones. And it was for the purpose, right, of indoctrinating children. And then I feel like America has picked this up and turned it into, like, you go to school to become good little factory workers or good little office workers or, sit there for 8 hours, basically dehumanized, right? A
Yeah,
piece of the machine, act
100%.
correct, and then and go home and, like, don't bring your drama here, don't bring your
Yeah.
humanity here.
And that's something that as I am reading, as because I'm almost done with the book for sure, and that's kind of one of the things that I'm getting ready to challenge my own students to think about because, like you said, we can think about it as a cult because it's almost like come here, we have a set of rules and a set of guidelines that you are to follow. There is no wiggle room within following that. If you don't follow them, there are very harsh consequences that can affect you post graduation. We are going to, we're going to kind of intimidate you into following these rules, even if you don't. If you are somebody who's not just willing to fall in line, you will find that you are treated as such, right? So if you are talkative or if you are, I guess more social, or if you don't know how to sit still and look up at the teacher and look into their eyes and recite information and it becomes this thing of like now we are looking at a bad student and bad
Yeah.
students equal bad workers. And so
But
how do we fix that?
and,
And that
he
becomes the issue.
here's what is kind of ironic to me because when people are like, "Oh, but you had no education."
Mhm.
Right? How did you keep up? How did you pass high school? Like, I was the perfect high school student. I
You
sat there, I looked at the teacher, I smiled, I could do rote memorization, I wouldn't dream of not turning in my homework, right? These are
exactly.
all skills, and I had been taught to, like, hear a bunch of gibberish, analyze it, and then give the teacher back exactly what they wanna hear, right?
Exactly what they want to hear. You had already been trained to comply with
Yeah,
no sort of um I mean, not even the thought
right,
to push back on anything, right?
yeah.
You just knew to comply. And that's really what we
Right.
expected out of
Mm,
school.
and the other thing is when you were just describing how we make the kids show up here, blah, 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 right? Like, the kids have no choice in
Mhm.
it, they have to do this, and that's very much the military.
Mhm.
And to be honest, in the prologue of Uncultured, where I'm holding the duffel bag above my head, and then I
Yes.
say in my mind, "Oh my god, I just joined another cult." And
Yeah.
my literal, off camera thought is like, "Well, I'm gonna be better at it than all these suckers." Right? Because, like, I know how to do this. Like, now I'm gonna do it as a soldier, but the pushing down your individuality, and I think this is
Mhm.
something that's probably true for, like, all trauma survivors or,
Yes.
like, all children who grew up under high control environments. It's like, you
Mhm.
know how to make your needs not matter at all and just let, what's good for the group take over.
Exactly.
Now
100%.
I call this the "I can do it with a broken heart." Like, all cult babies know how to do, it's like no matter
Mhm.
what's going on, we can suppress our own personality
Mhm.
and be a good group member. And that
Mhm.
in so many ways is what I think school requires children to do, what corporate America
Oh yeah.
requires people to do. To circle back around to the race thing, I think this is another reason why it's so complicated in the US because our
Mhm.
systems are made for monoculture, but we are the most diverse nation in the world.
Exactly. And I mean, even speaking to my own experience as both a student and a teacher, right? I think when you talk about this idea of suppressing your personality and who you are, and even the ways in which that very system is harmful to you as a person, and suppressing that and being good for the people around you, being good for the classroom, being good for the grade level, being good for the teachers, and even sometimes your parents, right? I think for me personally, like I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, so I guess you could technically call it the suburbs, even though I was born like in the city of Chicago. And I spent a lot of my time. I grew up in schools that were predominantly white. I mean, they were more diverse than a lot of other schools I know and have taught in, but they were predominantly white. And so immediately, like I was the type of child who, I mean, I could read at like a third grade level by the time I was in like first grade. Like I was pretty academically advanced compared to most kids in my class. But there would be many times in where I would come into school the first week or whatever, and like I would have teachers that would place me next to them because they had already assumed by just looking at me come into the classroom that I was going to be a
That you
behavior
were gonna
issue,
be trouble.
that I was not going to be able to read or write or do these things on my own. And they learned very quickly that I was soaring way above my classmates. And I could tell, right? I think a lot of the times with those of us that have kind of, been through our own traumas, we can tell when people are BSing you. Like we know when like you're doing this because you think I'm this, or we know how to play that game. And so I got very good at playing that game. I got very good at being like, yeah, I know what I'm doing, but it's almost like I know for me, I would act out almost, and be defiant as like a revolutionary tactic, right? Because I knew that I wasn't supposed to, but I'm gonna do it anyway because in my mind, I was thinking like, well, you can't get mad at me because I'm good at the student thing. Like I know what I'm doing, I get good grades, I get straight A's, so you can't really negatively impact me on a wider scale. And then also the trauma of being like I identify as gay, so also the trauma of being severely picked on, being not only just being like just a gay boy, right? Who didn't know at the time, but being black and being gay and like struggling in my family, but then coming to school and getting picked on, like those things were difficult. And like you mentioned, in the book about your high school counselor that like just saw in you, like let me let me get this young girl and help her to see like maybe a new avenue. I mean, I had plenty of teachers who just would see the kinds of horrendous things that were done to me and just ignore it and pretend like it didn't exist. And it made me learn very quickly, like, oh, they're doing that because they also think this way about me. I mean, teachers that would say to me, I'm being, a little gay boy who didn't know it at the time. I'd hang out with mostly girls. I would have teachers say to me, why don't you ever hang out with boys? Don't you want any male friends? Or I would, or complain about like boys being mean to me, and they'd go, "Well, maybe you should befriend them,"
Maybe you
and they would
should,
make fun of me.
yeah, put it on
And
you.
yeah, and so, and you learn, right? You learn how to just suck it up and do what's good for the group.
Well, and it's like it's a form of masking, right?
Mhm.
Like the perfect student thing. So when I don't know if you're at this part in the book yet, but at some point I'm like, okay, I got to figure out people. And I start like
Mhm.
studying. And it's like the first book I read was Third Culture Kids, right? Because I was, as a 24-year-old, I was like, I'm such a nice person. Why do people hate me?
Yes.
Like I need to figure it out. So I read Third Culture Kids, which is the first time in my life I felt understood even a little bit. And in this book, I read that good grades could be a sign of depression. And I was like,
Mm.
and like I don't think I've ever struggled with clinical depression, strangely enough. But
Mhm.
my trauma response to being
Yes.
literally dropped into a strange country, a strange state, the
Mhm.
house of an adult that I didn't know who wasn't around, and my trauma response was I can be the perfect student, you know. And then I I say fortunately, but unfortunately, honestly,
Mhm.
my only explanation for white privilege before I heard that term was like I get treated better than I deserve.
Mm.
Like everybody's giving me these chances. Like the teachers aren't treating me like I'm an indigent
Mhm.
16-year-old who lives on their own and from a
Mhm.
broken home and works for a living and blah blah blah, right? Like
Mhm.
when I'm in the there's financial aid in high school sometimes. Most people don't know that. When
Yeah,
I'm, like,
very true.
in the office getting my $20 handed to me, and I'm one of the few white kids in this inner city school, and everyone's always looking at me like, "Why are you here?"
Like, why is she in here? Yeah.
Or one, really hilarious one where the first time I take a Scantron test, I take it in pen. Like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I'm figuring out how we do this as I'm taking the test,
Mhm.
and I get back a test with a 0. So I go up to talk to this teacher, and all he
Mhm.
knows about me is I'm a student that's transferred in a few weeks ago, and I present like a 16-year-old English speaking American white girl. And in his mind, right, why am I pretending to not know how to take a Scantron test?
Mhm.
Meanwhile, I'm standing there trying not to cry. I have no idea why I've gotten a 0. I'm freaking out that I'm going to fail out of high school. I
Mhm.
mean, it's just, there's a lot of, there was a lot of that. And there was a lot of that throughout my life.
And I mean, yes, I especially when you talked about this notion of, like, good grades being, linked to clinical depression. I Now that was a new one for me. I actually didn't know that that was, they could be linked. It made sense to me later on when I thought about my own experience too. Similar to you, is that, like, if I'm being made to feel, or if I do feel right as a result of the things happening around me, that I'm not good enough in this area, maybe socially, or maybe, whatever the area is. I know I can lock in and get good grades, and that's going to validate me.
And
And oftentimes
that's
I see too.
exactly That's exactly what resonated for me, right? So
Mhm.
it wasn't that I thought I had clinical depression, but it was
Right.
that I I was in a school of 4,000 high school students. I couldn't
Mhm.
get anyone to notice me. I couldn't break into any friend groups. I had no clue, but I
Mhm.
could make the teachers love me.
Yep.
I could make the teachers know who I am. I could be the absolute best student. This would go on through college. Like, every
Mhm.
first teacher, first day of class knew that I was Hermione by
Yep.
the end of that first class, because that I
Mhm.
could control. And I
Yes,
think,
mostly.
like, to me, that's a thing that comes out of high of trauma survivors, or even like the adults in my life who took me in were wonderful, but they were expecting to get a more traditional falling apart problem case. And when it became obvious that I was going to get straight A's, it was like, okay, she's good,
Right.
and it's like, so I want to be very careful about what I say because, of course, I'm very, very grateful to them. Right. But it's like
Yes, absolutely.
sometimes you get more attention, or in a good way, or more attention from the adults in your life if you're struggling than if
Mhm.
you're doing well. Everyone just
Mhm.
thinks you're fine.
You're fine.
I Overall, I've it's interesting because I realized that in high school and college, I put myself into a high control, high demand system so
Mhm.
that I didn't have to think about my trauma or deal with anything, and like the way that I went through college. I mean, to graduate as valedictorian after no education, like, you can imagine I was a little crazy, and it wasn't till I came back around more than a decade later to do a master's degree that I was like,
Mhm.
"This is the first time I've done education in a healthy way, where I'm doing it to learn, to implement it in my life." And honestly, I look back and, in high school in college, I was a literature major. So I had to take
Mhm.
classes outside of literature, but in the arts, and
Right.
I wouldn't take an art class. I wouldn't take a dance class. I only would take history because I was so worried. Like, what if I get in this class and I can't paint and then I
Right.
fail, or then I get
Mhm.
a C?
Mhm.
I was so
Yep.
worried that I sort of kept myself in this. And don't get me wrong, literature and history absolutely expanded my mind, and I'm,
Right.
so grateful for the education that I got, but turns out in my adult life, I'm a good painter and I'm a good dancer, and there's, I could have explored so much more if I wasn't so obsessed with being perfect, but
Being
that
perfect.
was, like, the only thing that felt safe to me, if that makes sense. I'm sure
And
it
I think
does.
oftentimes, and I mean, I see it in myself similar to you, and I see it in the kids that I work with, too, in that there's this need to be perfect at something, and so they will often, and we will often overcompensate in one thing if we feel like we're not good at this thing. And we'll take that and say, "Well, look, 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 I can do this really well." Instead, and that's just a response to the trauma of it all, right? But I don't know, talking about, like, it's been interesting because even your experience and then, like, my experience being Black, I think that the interesting thing here is that what people don't realize, and I hope people can get this, is that our experiences are so much more, they're so much more intertwined than they are separate, regardless what we experience in race. And don't get me wrong, right? There are systems of privilege. Absolutely. There are, benefits that white people have, that Black and brown folks do not receive. But I think if people would be able to look at something and see, wow, there are similarities in the way that I live and in the way that I've experienced things alongside this person, that can get us to a place of, like, my freedom, right? My liberation, my health, my emotional maturity, my mental maturity is impacted and is directly related to yours. So when we don't see those things, I think it really, it strips us of our ability to see each other as whole and to see the kind of society that we want.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I hate about media. Let's just say the entertainment industry at
Mhm,
all, right? Is that, like,
mhm,
you have to convince investors that your story is going to draw people,
mhm,
and they'll be like, your story is niche, right? So, for example,
mhm,
100% I got the book deal for Uncultured that I got because I'm
mhm,
white. And, like, when I
mhm,
say, Uncultured is 382 pages long. That is longer than any memoir I know of except Michelle Obama's and Ketanji Brown Jackson. Okay.
mhm,
So if and I'm a white, straight presenting officer, right? If
mhm,
I had one more intersectionality to deal with, I couldn't have even approached it
mhm,
in the book. Although I do honestly regret not being further along in my anti-racism journey and pulling that
mhm,
into my analysis of the army, but I'm writing a whole second book for that. We grow, but there's this thing that I very much try with my audience, which is, like, it's not niche if white women go out and buy it. So, like, Joy Luck Club, which is
mhm,
written by Amy Tan. This was the
yep,
first book by an Asian American to go viral in the mass market
mhm,
ever. And it was looked at as a book about Chinese immigrants, women, and their American born daughters until all the white ladies went out and bought it. And then all of a
mhm,
sudden, it was a book about mothers and daughters,
mhm,
right? Because it's like that's the emotion level that you're
yes,
talking to.
yes,
So, one of the things that I'm actually obsessed with building in my little media empire is the, like, where you don't have to convince someone that your story has an audience.
mhm,
Like, sometimes you have to tell the story first and then find
100%,
the audience. So one of the things that I knew was that cult survivors and trauma survivors and high control group survivors and family cult survivors, like, that was not a niche group. That's a very
mhm,
large group.
mhm,
And I knew that because part of how I wrote Uncultured was to show that y'all think my life is so extreme, but then you tell me cult stories.
mhm,
So I was writing it to show that anyway.
Yes.
But, one of the things I say is like when you talk about emotions, like we're both looking at this super colorful necklace that I have, and like we're
Yes.
seeing the same color, but we're bringing different things to it. But if
Mhm.
you can describe your experiences and your emotions down to that level of that color, so somebody, it was a straight white Christian Republican man, but he
Shocker.
told me that there was no market for my stories because he didn't think anyone could relate to, or no, he said he didn't think a nice girl from Milwaukee who's never had anything bad happen to her couldn't relate to growing up in a sex cult or being a woman at war. But I don't need you to relate to growing up in a sex cult. I need you to relate to being 6 years old and alone and afraid and wishing you had a fairy godmother that was
Mhm.
gonna show up and take you to your new real parents, right? And that's why Disney's a billion-dollar industry.
Right, exactly. Right, exactly.
It's like lots of people can relate to that. As
Mhm.
soon as you say it's not just cults, it's group trauma, lots of
Mhm.
people can relate to that.
And
And
that's the thing, and something that even I have to do, right, as a Black man, like, you have to look at it through a different lens. Like, I think sometimes people look at experiences. I mean, even if we take, like, what's happening in our society right now, there are a lot of white folks that look at an experience through the lens of whiteness and their own lens of what they're experiencing, and they go, "Well, that's just not true," because they have this view of what I experience is the standard of what an experience actually is, they're oftentimes unable to, willing to look outside of that experience, and
yeah.
that does us all a disservice. And so, and on the other side of that, me as a Black man, I have grown up having to look at different experiences because that's just simply how life is, right? I have to go in to grocery stores and be watchful and be mindful of how I'm interacting with people. And there are people that will say, "Why are you doing that? You don't have to do that. You're not doing anything." And I'll go, "I know I'm not doing anything," but they don't, right? Or they don't think that. And so it's not all, and I think that it's in the conversations that I've even had with like my colleagues and even just other, friends and such, where they're like, "I just don't get it. Like, I just don't get it." And I always say it's not something that you need to get, it's something that you need to practice doing, right? It's something that you need to practice doing. Even if somebody says something to you like, "Hey, like, I know I've said to people in the past, I'll be like, if I was white, I definitely would have, because I'll give this story too. I coached cheerleading for a long time, and I have never been the head coach of any program that I've coached. Now, do I think that I've had the biggest impact on the teams that I've coached? Maybe. Do I think that I deserved the head coach position more than the people that were there? Absolutely. And I'll say to people, I'm like, it's because I'm Black. And it's not because the athletic director is, this racist, bigoted person. It's because they themselves cannot see, if they look at like what a cheerleading coach is supposed to look like or is
Mhm.
supposed to be off, they don't see me.
Mhm.
They see
Yeah.
me and people like me as an
Yeah.
assistant too. Right. So
And
that's
it
what makes sense for them.
and that kind of stereotyping, I think, is kind of what, like, I have the privilege to have fun with pushing back on
Hmm.
with my own identity, where it's like, people look at me and they see rich white lady, and I come from the furthest possible version of that, right? So it's
Hmm.
like the other way around. But where you were saying, this is why my favorite tip for white people that need to get into the practice, that are starting on their journeys, is from Ijoma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race. And she just says,
Yes.
when a Black person says some things about race, believe them.
Hmm.
And it is a literal switch you can flip. We probably don't even realize that we weren't believing before,
Hmm.
right? But we were trying to relate to it out of whiteness, like you were saying. But now let me tell you a story. So I read this book called Brotopia. right? And it was
Okay.
like, I was in my entrepreneur I was figuring out the Knitting Cult Lady brand, but
Right.
I was about 7 years away, okay? So I read this book called Brotopia, and it's about women's experience in tech and how, like,
Mm,
women's experience specifically is different and is negative. And it was like I was reading their experience, but I was thinking about the military, right? And it was the first time I saw something like laid out that way. So I go into this veteran entrepreneur program that I'm part of, right? Brain on fire. Like I do, I'm going to talk about it.
right.
And so I speak to 4 men on this day, right? And my basic thesis is my experience was different than yours because I'm a woman. End of story, right? And so the first 2 men I speak to were white boomers, and they just didn't get it, were angry at it, like, there was no way I could explain it that they could possibly accept it.
Mhm.
The 3rd guy I talked to was a white male veteran who was studying diversity and inclusion, who was getting a degree in diversity and inclusion, and he wanted to get it, but he still couldn't get it, right?
Mhm.
He's still so married to that, "But I worked for everything I had," right? And then the 4th veteran was a black man, and I literally said it to him, cocked his head. I didn't think he'd ever considered that before. And then he was like, "Okay, yeah." And I was like, "Yep," because
Mhm.
he knows that his experience was different from those other 3 because he was a black man. So he can therefore see that that must be true for my experience as well.
Yes. And
And that
100%.
was fascinating for me, and that
Mhm.
actually really helped. It was probably 2 or 3 years later when Mr. Knitting Coat Lady would come to me and say, "Babe, I need help." Like, he said, "I
Mhm.
need you to explain male privilege to me."
Mhm.
And he says, "'Cause I know you're so smart and I wanna believe you, but I feel like I've worked for everything I had." Right?
Mhm.
And so I said to him, I said, "Okay, so in 1989, when you're 8 years old and you see Top Gun and you decide you wanna be a pilot and everyone in your life falls behind helping you make that happen, would they have done that for your sister?" And that worked well because he had a younger sister and he knew that they wouldn't, and also he knew that women couldn't be pilots in 1989.
Exactly.
And that right? It's like it's a mental
Mhm.
shift, like you said, and after that, it's a practice. So for me,
Exactly.
it's like that kind of thing is the crack in the brainwashing. That kind of
Mhm.
thing is for me, it was really dramatic. I'm writing about it in another project, Un-American,
Mhm.
but somebody was trying to use me as to refute white privilege, but that was the first time I heard the term, and I
Right.
was like, "Oh, no."
It's like, "No, no,
And I was
no,
like
not
"No,
quite."
no, no, right here, right now, I can think of 10
Yeah.
men, like, right now."
And even this idea because I really do like having these conversations. And again, I'm getting my master's in social work. I plan to get to go into a PhD in social work as well. And one of the things I love talking about is when people are taught when I especially with white folks, when they talk about this idea of, well, I worked so hard, I worked for everything I have. And I'm like, you're so close. You're so close with that because what we're trying to get at here is that you did. I'm not saying that you didn't, right? We all work for what we have. Well, most of us, some of us. Some of us are handed things, but that's a whole nother conversation. But we work for what we have, right? But why is it that when you work for what you have and I work for what I have, you still look at me and think I haven't worked as hard as you? I think that it begs that what's that reasoning, and
That's
engage in that kind of
basically
conversation with yourself.
and that's basically how that worked for me, right? It was because
Mhm.
somebody was literally trying to be like, "Well, obviously, Captain Messinek, you of all people know that white privilege doesn't exist because I mean, I came to America with $0 by
Mhm.
myself. I literally and I say this in an American where it's like, yeah, but when I pulled myself up by those bootstraps, nobody was waiting there to kick the door down.
Mhm.
Like nobody was locking it or keeping me out. Like and
100%.
another one I noticed was when my daughter was born.
Mhm. Mhm.
So my daughter's born in 2016, and we decided we were gonna raise her in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So
Mhm.
I did Portuguese, she had a caregiver do Spanish, and then she got English from her dad and the
Mhm.
world. So for a while, I had a trilingual daughter, and I myself am trilingual, but I
Mhm.
really noticed it with my daughter when I had, like, a 3 and 4-year-old blonde white girl speaking Spanish and Portuguese, and people just fawn over
Mhm.
her, just fall over themselves with how amazing it is. And I noticed it with me, like I had a friend in the army who was black, but she spoke German because she was half German, and people were
Right.
always like confused and then a little bit angry and, like completely different response that I get. Or like people would actually try to argue with me that what I was speaking with my daughter was French and not Portuguese because of their stereotypes, or I have to
It's
call
yep.
it Brazilian Portuguese because if I just said Portuguese, they would try to argue with me that I must be
Uh-huh.
from Portugal because we have to put a hierarchy to this. And I
Exactly.
finally,
Mhm.
Jamal, by the time it was 2020, I just literally started looking at people and being like, are you like this when brown kids are bilingual? Like, are you this impressed when black kids speak 3 languages? Like, no. The answer is no.
The answer is no,
And
and I
that's
want them
like,
to invest
I
in it.
have
Mhm.
always been considered the smartest person in the room by my boss because I speak 3 languages, even though I've never had to use my languages for my job. And
Mhm.
if you had my exact same resume and you spoke 3 languages, it would not, like, you would not get the same response.
Yeah, people would almost think like, "What's up with
Like,
this
why?
guy?" You know what I mean? There would be this, like, energy around it, like, "Why is he speaking 3 languages, and what's that about?" Like, I mean, I might in this day and age, I mean, it might be detrimental to me, right? Because I teach students who are bilingual and biliterate, and just the vitriol that they face in the world, sometimes in the school building, is crazy to see, but really there is actual research behind the brain power it takes to be able to communicate in 2 languages, and I think that is when white people see that sometimes what they are bringing to the table is not enough, and people are that don't look like them are out there doing things that, can be deemed or perceived to be as smarter, harder working, more successful. The question that they are posed is, well, why how did they get that and not me? And so I think it's important. And I always challenge even my own students, and I'm a black teacher, and they're white, and I have white kids in my class, And so like even sometimes I have to challenge them and I have to say, would you say that to your social studies teacher? Would you say that to your PE teacher? Even when it comes to like me being black and gay, I will say, like, would you say that to your sociology teacher? Would you have that
Yeah.
kind of remark? And it's just to get them to think like, "Oh, would I?" And oftentimes the answer is no. And we have to think why, and
Yeah, and that's such an understated form of privilege, right? And
mhm,
you'll see me do this on my platform a lot when I get questioned about my military expertise. And it's like, just the question would not be asked if I was a man.
exactly,
Like, you wouldn't
exactly.
even ask me the question. And sure enough, when my husband sits down in front of the camera, all white, male, blue
Mhm.
eyed, my husband, who I outrank, right?
Exactly.
Nobody asks him like the competency check. Nobody's like, what's your military resume?
Mhm.
Like it's just not, it,
And by the way,
they just accept
a
it.
knitting I love a knitting cult lady comeback is what I call them, because they deserve it every time. And you know what? And let's talk
They
about that because
do.
like you say, they and some of the questions in that comment section just get to be, it's like, wow. And they're so snarky. And I'm just like, for one, like I always hate the whole, like, we can't even see you. We don't know what you got going on. We don't know, that's number one. But it's like you said, you would never ask this question of a man. You would never question like that. There are men that get on that app every day and just lie through their teeth and people just believe it. It's because of the privilege of being a man,
Yeah.
right? Especially a white one.
And
And
it's the
so
lack of being questioned, right?
mhm,
Like, I've been teaching my daughter about paperwork privilege, receipt
mhm,
privilege. Like, I
mhm,
never need to take a receipt when I leave a store. Like, it's just not a thing. It just doesn't matter. If I have to return it later, they're gonna like, I've never been suspected of shoplifting, even though I did a lot of shoplifting as a young,
right,
disturbed teenager. Like, I it's just the amount I paperwork, my my name is
mhm,
complicated, and I didn't have documents that match. And yet in Texas, still was able to get my driver's license. Top secret
look at that.
clearance. I guarantee you they did not look very hard into my background at all. They were like, "Oh,
Mhm,
Christian missionaries in Brazil. Okay."
okay,
Versus I had any other color of skin.
mhm,
I don't think I was getting a secret clearance with my background with that many international connections, right? There was this very it's the pure white girl thing. It's the skinny white woman, right? That
mhm.
I talk about in the next book. And it's that part of the system that just works for you that you're not aware of.
Yeah, and, like, when I would challenge people that are listening and wanting to deconstruct whiteness, right, and wanting to do that and not having a place to start, like you just said, I think is really important, is when Black people, Latinx people, gay people, when they tell you something or when they specifically if we're talking about race, right, if Black people say something to you about how they are experiencing racism in a situation, believe them without questioning it.
Mhm.
Even if you don't really believe them intellectually, physically believe them. That will begin the practice of deconstructing. Okay, if I just believe what they say, trust me, you will also begin to see, huh, hmm,
Mhm.
listen to them when they talk to you. And I don't mean, and we hear things like listen to understand and not listen to respond, but it's real. I really want people to do that because you have to listen with the intent of hearing somebody's story and trying to just paint that picture in your mind of what that looks like, not for you, but just in just the world, right?
Yeah.
And do that kind of work and be intentional about that practice. And guess what? It's not always going to feel good either. And that's what I
No.
think a lot of white people struggle with is that they find that it's really, really difficult for them to sit back and say, wow, like the people that are, racially in my demographic are not great people. And when it comes to this
Yeah.
race thing. And
And
that's true and it can be okay. And you can still learn from that, right?
yeah, and I think that's true of deconstructing all worldviews,
Most
that's
definitely.
like it doesn't feel great to realize that you've been like sold a lie this whole time or
Mm-hmm.
to realize that like the things that you did. I mean, I've talked about this a lot on my shows, but I told a black woman at my wedding that she looked exotic. And I've learned a lot since then. Right. And I still like it's still just so cringe to me. Right. But that's how we learn. That's how we grow. I think your point of like reading and reading broadly and, the way in America that we sell books and we talk about books is you have to read a book by someone exactly like you.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this is something I think is interesting about Uncultured is that when military men go to write a book, there are enough other military men. There are 12 million male veterans in the country. So they can just write it in military language. They don't have to translate it. When they make movies, it's the same thing, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
all have to try to understand the army. But
Mm-hmm.
when I set out to write a book, Uncultured is the first memoir by a woman veteran on the mass market to get like mass market treatment. When I set out to write a
Mm-hmm.
book, they were like, we don't do books by military women. Nobody reads them. Right? There's only a million women veterans. This is not enough of a market for the big publishers to try to go after. You need a bigger one because you're only going to grab a portion. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that first of all, I'm very proud of this. I wrote 150 pages about the military and used not one single acronym, right? Like everything's explained in context. And I think like maybe I'm one of the first people that actually had to try to translate the military experience to civilians because
Hmm.
the men don't have to when they do that in the similar way of other things that we've been talking about, you know.
Yes, right, and this is, relating to that privilege aspect.
And
But when
I
it
think
comes to
that
uncultured, oh, I was gonna say when it comes to uncultured, and you were mentioning like just reading the not having to read books that just directly reflect like your race, your sexuality, your gender, right? I think that's what pulled me to not only you on social media, but this novel and this memoir because it's like, I wanna know what this experience was because we don't hear about it, right? And I want us
yeah,
to be thoughtful and wondering, these voices that we don't normally hear, they're not just not there, right? Because we know about women in
yeah.
the military. Why we should be questioning why are there no memoirs? Why is that? And so when one comes along,
That was
oh
my
yeah,
question.
you better believe I'm gonna pick one up and I'm gonna dig into it because I wanna hear what this woman has to say. Um, and 9 times out of 10, this is what I know about women, period, right, are more likely to tell the truth about what's going on
Yeah,
in a situation and be honest about a situation and be vulnerable enough to relate a story. And it's like my entire I teach we have 8 periods in our day, I teach 6 of them.
yeah.
Every single student in all 6 of those periods. And again, we I there are kids that are white that are from, the north side that have money. There are kids that are from, the west side of Chicago where, a very different socioeconomic status. They all are interested because the story itself matters, right? They're all
Yeah,
wanting to read it. And I think that alone speaks to this idea of there's always a market for a story. There's always
yeah,
people that are going to listen, and we do just want to get to know each other better. And there are ways to do that, right? There's ways to kind of deconstruct these notions of race and gender and class and all those things, so that we can just experience each other as humans
yeah,
freely. And I think that's what makes our
yeah,
experience here, right? The most the most joyful.
yeah. And, just to hear all the voices. And this is what actually excites me about all the new the all the gatekeepers don't have the gates anymore. Like the gates are pretty much flung wide open right now and we're getting to have different opportunities. And I would also just encourage the listeners like read broadly because you never know what is going to be
Yes.
your thing. Like I'm obsessed with Tudor England, which is a normal autistic white girl obsession, but also like a specific period in Chinese history novels
Yes.
and memoirs from Black Caribbean immigrants to a specific part of London are also very, very good. So, like, you just
Yeah.
have no idea
I
what niches you're going to find that like we started that someone would never say like this is your key reader, but here we are with stories speaking to each other. So thank you, Jamal, so much for what you do with kids and your care and your interest and for this conversation.
Yes, yes, and thank you, Captain, for having me, for inviting me in the space to talk to your listeners and be a part of your platform. I mean, I'm eternally grateful. I mean, and we've had this conversation where, like, the reading of this book has changed the entire trajectory of what I see for myself professionally, personally in this world after a very difficult period for me dealing with like some loss and some struggles. I mean, this book like almost single-handedly has kind of completely reignited my flame for how to move forward in my own life. And so I can't thank you enough for that.
That's amazing.
I really appreciate that. And you'll be getting letters from me and all my students. So stay tuned. Trust me, because they are excited. I'm excited.
Amazing.
We
I
will
know.
connect. So thank you
I'm
so much.
excited too. Tell them hi. And I'm sending a Saturnita. Thank you.
When I tell you, I have one girl in particular, like, I'm thinking about her, she might actually cry. Like, she might actually cry, like, from joy, I'm not even kidding, because they know who you are, they see you on social media, and when they if they find out I'm even doing this, they're gonna freak, so we'll see, we'll see,
Oh my gosh. Maybe we'll have to do like a class on thing.
oh my
So
gosh, they would love that, but I'm so glad that we get to connect, and I look forward to learning more from you and, kind of building this connection further, but yes, I'm eternally grateful, so thank you so much.
thanks, Jamal. Thanks, everybody. See you later.